So the article I'm discussing today was brought to my attention by a gentleman named Mr. Merchant in my Discord server. If you have a article or video you want me to respond to, go ahead and share it in my Discord server. Link will be in the description. And of course, just a reminder, patrons get preferential request consideration. That being said, let's get into it. Just when I thought this whole corona hysteria has hit an all-time low, out comes an article basically advocating that people, and I shit you not, walk up to strangers and fucking yell at them. The article comes from a website called Yahoo Life, and the author is a Mr. Matt Schneiderman, and the title is, of course, It Is Okay to Yell at People Who Don't Wear Masks. And right below the title, we have this lovely bit of artwork here depicting a masked crowd appearing to be angry and hostile toward this one gentleman who's not wearing a mask. And I feel this picture very nicely sets the stage for what we're in for, this idea of hostility. Why settle our disagreements in a civilized way when we can pout and throw tantrums like 10-year-olds? Anyways, Mr. Schneiderman here begins his article with the following, quote, roughly two-thirds of Americans say they wear masks in public. Unfortunately, that still leaves a substantial portion of potential COVID-19 carriers unmasked. Coming across anyone flouting public health recommendations and putting you, your family, and community at risk triggers a number of thoughts and feelings. Depending on the situation, your annoyance could range from a mild simmer to an all-out rolling boil. So what do you do? End quote. Alright, so just kind of taking it from the top. First, regarding the claim that two-thirds of Americans say they wear masks in public. I see some potential issues with this statistic. First of all, there's the definition of in public. How do you define what counts as a person being in public? Is it anywhere outside of their home, or does it have to be at a particular location where people tend to gather? This is made especially confusing by all the variants among the mask orders. You see, the specifics behind the mandatory mask orders vary on a state and even local basis. See, here in Maryland where I live, a mask is only required inside of a public building. So to go in a grocery store or restaurant, you'd have to wear a mask, but just if you're outside like at a park or something, you don't have to wear one. Whereas some states, you do have to wear a mask outdoors. Some states, as soon as you leave your front door, it's mask time. So someone telling you that they wear a mask in public is kind of meaningless because what in public specifically means may vary between different people. Another problem with this statistic is that it kind of assumes that people are being truthful. It's very much possible that someone may not wear a mask usually, but with all the COVID hysteria and the mask shaming out there, they might feel pressured into answering that they do, even if they normally don't. And of course, the mask is really only effective if they're wearing the proper mask and they're wearing it properly. So if they have the right type of medical mask that blocks viruses and it's covering their mouth and nose, only then is it really effective. But for the time being, let's put these problems with the statistics aside. Let's take it as a given that everyone involved answered truthfully that they wear a mask everywhere in public and they wear it properly. Two-thirds is still pretty good. I've explained in previous videos why every single person in the country wearing a mask constantly is an unrealistic expectation. A majority of the population is really the best you can hope for. But more importantly, we kind of see a problem here with how the issue is framed. See, the author is trying to portray all people who don't wear masks as if they are potential COVID-19 carriers, as opposed to autonomous human beings simply making decisions about how much risk they're willing to take. This, of course, strikes me as a type of poisoning the well strategy, in which the author is attempting to plant a bias against the opposing viewpoint in the audience before they even get into the main arguments. It also highlights the type of guilty until proven innocent mentality that's going on here. You see, the author wants you to be concerned that people may potentially be spreading the virus, whether or not they actually are. The problem is that this violates a basic principle of justice, that everyone is assumed innocent until proven guilty. You see, under the non-aggression principle, the standard by which we evaluate whether or not forceful intervention is justified is if the person is actually causing harm, not potential harm. The reason for this is that anybody could potentially be harming anybody at any given point. Trying to prevent all of it would simply be infeasible. If you ever watch the film The Minority Report, you'll get an idea of why exactly it is we should go after people who actually cause harm as opposed to simply potentially causing harm. And of course, I think the biggest problem with this line of reasoning with regard specifically to the coronavirus masks is that even people who are wearing masks are still potential COVID-19 carriers. You see, the mask doesn't block every single droplet that comes out of your mouth. It blocks most of them, granted, but not all of them. Some do still make it through. This means that even people who wear masks can still spread the virus. Wearing the mask may reduce the possibility of spread, but it doesn't eliminate it entirely. So if we're going after people who are potential COVID-19 spreaders, well, you'd have to go after some of the people wearing masks too. Especially with all the other variables you take into account, for example, what type of mask they're wearing, how they're wearing it, etc. And then we get some more of your typical fear mongering about how they're putting you, your family, and your community at risk, etc., etc. A lot of this is just hyperbolic fear mongering, not backed up by any data. I mean, sure, you know what? If wearing a mask helps reduce the spread of the virus, maybe it's a good idea to wear one. Sure, maybe I'll concede that. But for fuck's sake, let's get real, people. Not wearing a mask isn't the same thing as murdering somebody's grandmother, okay? You people need to chill your shit. And a final thing of note to discuss here is that if seeing someone without a mask on makes you experience an all-out raging boil, you've got bigger problems than COVID-19. You know what's really making me experience an all-out raging boil? This fucking article right here. Quote, "First off, your indignation at that Target shopper in front of you in line without so much as a handkerchief around their neck is warranted. Wearing a mask is crucial. The medical community, including White House Health Advisor Dr. Anthony Fauci, has said in as many ways as possible that Americans who aren't wearing face masks are increasing the risk of spreading the coronavirus. Even asymptomatic carriers of the virus may be spreading the disease. It's absolutely reckless to expose the elderly and other at-risk groups to airborne coronavirus. The reason for social distancing and wearing masks in the first place," end quote. So first of all, with regards to the handkerchief, this kind of goes back to a point I mentioned earlier. There isn't a whole lot of consistency among mask wearers. Different states have different rules, different cities have different rules, even different businesses have different rules. So some places just require a facial covering, some places, you can put your shirt over your nose and it counts. Other places, you have to have a full-on mask. And this is why there just is so much variance with regards to how much exactly these mask wearers are spreading the coronavirus, or how much the masks are actually protecting people. But putting that aside for the time being, let's look at the point regarding what the medical community believes. Just like you have a lot of variance with the mask requirements and the mask orders, you also have a lot of variance with regards to the medical community and their opinion on masks. Some professionals are telling us the masks are effective, some are telling us they're not that effective, some of them are even saying they actually make it worse. Not only that, but the medical professionals that say the masks are effective, there's usually even variance within that as terms of, what types of masks to wear, or how to wear the mask, etc. So it's hardly like the entire medical community in the world is on a consensus about masks. And even the hero Dr. Fauci has changed his opinion so many times. As a matter of fact, way back in March, I think it was Fauci who was telling people that not to wear masks, that they make it worse or whatever, or that regular people shouldn't be buying masks because then you're hogging it up for all the medical professionals, or, something along those lines. So a lot of these experts that folks are expecting us to trust keep changing their story. It's kind of difficult for us to trust them. But even if we put all these problems aside, I think the biggest problem here is the appeal to authority fallacy. I mean, who cares if authority says something? Authorities can be wrong. Experts are wrong all the time. And a lot of these experts, like Dr. Fauci, have a lot of political connections, so that may influence what they have to say, so they may not necessarily be giving us the truth. I think for something especially as important as health, the data should be independently verified. People shouldn't take what the experts say on face value. They should go out, do research, and verify these things for themselves. And then there's more fear-mongering about asymptomatic spread. Put simply, if a disease has such low level of noticeable symptoms that we need to implement a blanket mask mandate onto everybody out of fear that they may be asymptomatic, then the disease probably isn't that big of a deal. It's like, take a minute to think about it. People are making all this fuss over spreading a disease that ultimately has very few symptoms. And then they shame people, oh, how reckless of you to endanger vulnerable people. Well, isn't it kind of reckless for those vulnerable people to put themselves in harm's way and not take precautions themselves? I mean, it just doesn't make any sense. An overwhelming majority of the population isn't affected by this virus, but a tiny minority of vulnerable people are. Well, wouldn't it make more sense to put quarantine measures on that small minority of vulnerable people rather than the overwhelming majority of healthy people? Like, if someone is elderly or immunodeficient, they should take precautions to protect themselves from every disease, not just COVID. So not only is an overwhelming majority of the population not susceptible to this virus, but the overwhelming majority that's not susceptible to this virus is being punished because the minority that are susceptible to it can't be bothered to take the proper precautions. Quote, "But understanding a situation is important. Some people might not be wearing their mask, letting it dangle around their neck for a minute because they were hot or uncomfortable. Some people may have simply spaced out on wearing a mask outside of their home because, honestly, mask wearing is not yet second nature. Other people, particularly minorities, might not be wearing a mask of any sort in certain areas because covering their faces will be more dangerous than catching COVID 19. And yes, there are some for whom not wearing a mask is a willful act of assholery. These people are unwilling to conform to a new societal norm and refuse to yield to what they believe to be their right to breathe free. End quote. So first of all, it's really none of your business why someone else is or isn't wearing a mask. I mean, if somebody is in a business or on a piece of property and the owner decides to implement a mandatory mask rule as a condition of being there, that's a different story. But for the most part, we're all independent, autonomous adults. We all have the freedom, the right to make decisions regarding our own health. Wearing a mask should be a personal choice. Now, me personally, I'm not strictly pro-mask or anti-mask. I'm not going to sit here and tell you to wear one or not to wear one. The people who wear masks have their reasons. The people who don't wear masks have their reasons, and I respect both. There are pros and cons to wearing masks, and of course my opinion is that everyone should go out and do research and figure it out for themselves whether or not they want to wear a mask. Now, if you are one of these people who are pro-mask, who thinks people should be wearing masks, I'm going to tell you right now, being a condescending prick about it isn't going to help. For example, in this article, the author is describing not wearing a mask as a willful act of assholery and moral white knighting about societal norms. What you're really doing here is making the whole pro-mask crowd seem like a bunch of self-righteous pricks, which if anything is going to make people less likely to want to wear masks, not more likely. And why should something be obligatory just because it's a societal norm? I mean, we're all unique individuals with our own thoughts, feelings, lives, etc. If what I'm doing isn't hurting anybody, then it's really nobody else's business. Quote, of course, there's no way to know exactly which type of non-face mask wearer you're dealing with, and there are ways to approach a situation delicately before your anger boils over. So before you form a posse of fellow shoppers to shame them, what the fuck, consider alternatives to confrontation. Start slow and escalate as needed, following these 5 steps, end quote. So one thing I've noticed in this article is that the author has a tendency to mention people who choose not to wear masks in very derogatory and dehumanizing terms. You're not a fellow human being simply making choices I disagree with. You're a potential COVID-19 carrier. You're a non-mask wearer. If I was someone who was skeptical of masks or anti-mask and I was reading this article, I wouldn't be thinking, oh gee, those are some good points. Maybe I should consider wearing a mask. I'd think, holy shit, this guy's a fucking douche. I'm not listening to any more of what he has to say. Now, granted, it seems like the target audience for this article was other people in the pro-mask crowd, so maybe that's why it wasn't necessarily taking into consideration how the opposition is being portrayed. Yet again, it still doesn't look good for the pro-maskers. And while I am forced to commend the author for at least understanding why it is that peaceful means are preferable to confrontational ones, I'd still like to think, as a civilized society with basic standards of decency, certain things would just kind of be off the table. Like, I can't really think of a situation that would warrant basically forming a mob of customers to bully other customers. I mean, the shit that this author's describing sounds like something out of an SNL sketch. Quote, the 5 stages of mask wearing grief. When you find yourself in a situation with someone who isn't wearing a mask, here's how to gauge your reaction, how to handle the situation empathetically, and when to really let them have it, end quote. So at this point, we start to get into the meat and potatoes of the article. The author lists off 5 stages of mask-wearing grief and what to do about them. Actually, it's more like 4, because as you'll see here shortly, 1 and 2 are basically the same. Quote, Stage 1, minor annoyance. When your anger is at this level, your best option in most scenarios is to let it go. As long as they're not willfully putting anyone else in danger, and as annoying as it may be to have to walk away, your gut is telling you this is not worth a fight. Listen to your gut. Stage 2. Pretty annoyed. You're ticked off. Your anger heightened by a justifiable fear for your family and community. Still, the risk of getting COVID-19 from this person is unlikely, and getting close enough to exchange words is a surefire way you can increase your chances of exposure. Get away if possible, end quote. Alright, so I did decide to discuss these 2 together, simply because they're in essence the same thing. It's basically, hey, you're pissed off, but it's not really worth exposing yourself to danger over, so don't worry about it. The author really could have just combined these into one reason and then just have 4 stages, but this seems like something a college student would do in order to get their paper to be a minimum number of paragraphs, as some sort of requirement for the assignment, but whatever. And while I do generally agree with the author on this point that it's not that big of a deal that going up to them and starting a confrontation, especially if you're afraid they might be carrying a disease, would be a good idea given how trivial it is. But in spite of that, there's 2 things to point out here. First of all, the use of words like grief or annoying. I like how the author frames it to be as if not pestering people is annoying. Gee, goddammit, I wish I could go over and harass that person, but I can't. That's so dang annoying. And there also seems to be a bit of a contradiction in the reasoning here. The other thing to point out is that On the one hand, this person's making COVID-19 out to be this huge deal where it's such this horrible, awful disease, and everyone who's not wearing a mask is just recklessly spreading it around. But at the same time, they're downplaying it. Oh, there's not that big of a chance of you catching it from somebody. And they might be recklessly endangering people, but it's best to just leave them alone. And now that I think about it, why would it be dangerous for you to actually go confront this person? I mean, presumably this article was written for the pro-mask crowd, so I'm assuming that the person confronting involved in the situation would be wearing a mask of their own. Well, wouldn't the mask be protecting them if the other person is COVID? I mean, even a lot of people in the pro-mask crowd argue that the mask protects the wearer as well as the people around them. Quote, Stage 3. A growing anger. This is a level where not saying something bears a greater risk than saying something, say at a kid's birthday party. Obviously, knowing the person not wearing a face mask or knowing someone there who does makes engaging them far less fraught, but it should still be done considerately. Initiate any conversation with someone not wearing a face mask as just that, a conversation, instead of instructing them to wear a face mask, or else get curious. People do not like to be forced to do things, and that's why we are getting with non-compliance and wearing masks when people feel they're being pushed to do so, says Dr. Alan Chu, assistant professor of psychology at the University of Wisconsin Green Bay. Ask the following statements based on motivational interviewing techniques in order to help people take ownership to make the change you want to see. End quote. Well, the very first thing to point out is that depending on the age of the children involved, a kid's birthday party might actually be the safest place to not wear a mask, since young people not only have stronger immune systems, but it might actually be better for them to catch COVID at that age, because when you're that young, your immune system can learn what COVID is and can react to it better, and you build up immunity to it at that younger age. But without getting too tangential here, I actually kind of like this point. It strikes me as a very civilized and intellectual way to deal with the disagreement at hand. It even has elements of the Socratic method. Engage in a discussion, frame it as a conversation rather than a debate. Press them for information, ask questions, learn. As a student of philosophy, I can definitely appreciate the Socratic element to the strategy. And I think this is precisely the type of discussion that we as a society should be having about the effectiveness of masks and whether or not to wear one. Because as that psychology professor that they cite points out, that people hate being told what to do. If you tell someone you must do this whether you want to or not, then naturally there's going to be resistance and resentment. If wearing a mask really is the best way to prevent the spread of this virus, I think the best way to get people to wear them isn't forcing them to, but rather having this type of discussion where we try to educate people on how effective they are. And the professor goes on to give an example of how such a conversation might play out. Quote, here are the statements Chu suggests, with their intents. Number 1. I'm curious why you're not wearing a mask, so gathering information. Number 2. I see your point. What do you think about the research evidence that shows wearing a mask can significantly reduce the chance of infection? Are you concerned about your health and your family's? Showing empathy, indicating facts, care, prompting thoughts. Number 3. What are the costs and benefits for you to wear a mask? Understanding any perceived barriers and getting them to analyze the fact that there are more benefits than costs. Number 4. What would you do after this conversation in order to make this a habit during these times? Helping them put thoughts into actions and take ownership instead of being enforced to do so. End quote. So I definitely like the idea of having a conversation about this. I think it's much more intellectual and civilized and effective than just, going up to people, yelling at them, shaming them, whatever, being a dick. And I do think it is an important conversation to be had because, what's more important than health, right? If there's something out there that can keep people safe, prevent harm, or people from getting sick, I definitely think that's something we should discuss. And while I have no problem with a pro-masker using this type of strategy to get someone to wear a mask, I do have a problem with Mr. Chu's sample argument. You see, the sample conversation he gives seems very one-sided. Here's what I mean by that. You may have picked up on the fact that some of these questions have the pro-mask conclusion baked into them. In particular, questions 2 and 4. While questions 1 and 3 come across as a very neutral, balanced, just sort of inquiry for information, questions 2 and 4 seem to be loaded in the pro-mask direction. For example, if we take a look at question 2, I see your point. What do you think about the research evidence that shows that wearing a mask can significantly reduce the chance of infection? Well, the problem is that presupposes that the research evidence bears that conclusion. There's a lot of evidence that actually bears a different conclusion. There is some evidence that says a mask doesn't do anything or makes it worse. You see the same problem with question 4. What would you do after this conversation to make it a habit during these times? Well, who says that it needs to be a habit? So as where questions 1 and 3 are more balanced, just a inquiry for information, these seem to actually be pushing towards the conclusion that you should wear a mask. The problem with that is that you're now approaching this conversation with a presupposition of what you think the conclusion should be. You're more likely to filter out any counter arguments brought up by the other person. Like I said before, I am all in favor of having a discussion over masks, but if you are going to do this, if you're going to have a conversation, make sure you're having an actual conversation. Make sure that you are being open-minded and listening to the other person, as opposed to just peddling your own propaganda. Stage 4 is basically the same thing as stage 3. Like, hey, I know you're pissed about it, but better to have a conversation than to be confrontational. So that brings us down to what, 3 stages? I think this author should probably learn how to condense their thoughts, make them more comprehensive to read. And also, if you're in the checkout line at Walmart, it's a bit late for the whole mask conversation, because at that point the person's already been throughout the whole store spreading their germs around. So if they're in the checkout line, you're kind of late. So far, this article wasn't actually that bad. As a matter of fact, it actually gives some pretty reasonable advice about how to deal with your frustrations. If the article ended here, it actually wouldn't be that bad. This is where things go batshit crazy. Stage 5. Go fuck yourself. But of course they use symbols instead of spelling out the word fuck because, encouraging bullying and harassment is fine, but swearing is where we draw the line, right? Anyways, quote, here, the person seems to willfully be endangering those around them. Your anger is appropriately ballistic. Just as you'd scream at a driver doing 100 miles per hour in a school zone, you're going to scream at a person not wearing a face mask when you're standing in line because you're in line with your kids and elderly people. If you've tried the softer approach and hit a wall of willful ignorance or downright anger, get help. If you're in a store, inform customer service. The on-site manager or another employee should enforce the business's rules, a la no shirt, no shoes, no service. As much legal right as the person may have outside the store to flout mask wearing, inside it's the store's right to refuse them. If a person is blatantly putting others at risk, you've tried the above tactics, and you're not in a business setting and want to get a message across, go for it. Let loose a salvo of swear words. Sometimes you just need to yell. End quote.
What you just said is one of the most insanely idiotic things I have ever heard. At no point in your rambling, incoherent response were you even close to anything that could be considered a rational thought. Everyone in this room is now dumber for having listened to it. I award you no points, and may God have mercy on your soul.
So this is extremely idiotic, but let's break it down. First of all, if you think that not wearing a mask endangers people as much as speeding at 100 miles an hour, you're fucking high. But this also kind of shows us his sort of binary mentality when it comes to risk. Alright, someone's doing 100 through a school zone. What time of day is it? Is it during the day when all the kids are inside, or is it in the evening as they're getting off? The way you answer that will affect how much risk there is involved in that situation. And I feel there's a similar problem with a lot of the COVID hysteria going on. They're treating risk as a very binary thing when it's actually a very multi-factored and multifaceted thing. And in doing so, we end up creating more rather than less risk. We've seen this with the lockdowns. People are painting this false dichotomy between the economy and public health when the two actually go together. But anyways, without getting too off the rails, the author seems to be contradicting himself here. Like before, earlier, when we were talking about the more peaceful ways of dealing with this, they said if this doesn't work, just leave them alone. If you try to have a conversation with them and they're not being responsive, they're fighting back, they're arguing, just leave them alone, right? Well, now it seems like they've completely reversed that position, and now instead of saying if these tactics don't work, just leave the situation, now it's if these tactics don't work, be a dick and fucking scream like a 5-year-old. Now, of course, if you're inside of a private establishment that has a rule requiring masks to enter the building, and of course you see someone without a mask and they're making you uncomfortable, then yeah, sure, maybe you can go up to one of the employees or the manager and say, hey, there's a customer over there not following your rules. It's making me feel uncomfortable, because like I talked about before, because stores are private property, businesses are private property, the owner has the right to set the rules, and they can say, hey, you want to come in here, you want to do business with us, mask up, buttercup. But if they're on public property, or if they're on their own property, or if they're on someone else's property who doesn't require a mask, well then, if they're making you feel uncomfortable, you gotta leave. Leave the situation. Don't sit there and be an asshole. And finally, with regards to screaming at people who don't wear masks, what exactly is this supposed to accomplish? Is it supposed to prevent the spread of the virus? Well, obviously not, because when you're screaming, when you're projecting your voice, you're more likely to spit up droplets. You're much, much, much more likely to spread the virus, probably more than someone simply not wearing a mask. We're concerned about asymptomatic spread, which is why we suggest people go up to random strangers and fucking yell at them. So obviously it doesn't accomplish, preventing the spread of the virus. Does it accomplish getting people to wear masks? Well, I can tell you if some jackass came up to me and just started yelling at me, I wouldn't be sitting there thinking, oh gee, this person's making some good points. Maybe I should wear a mask. I'd be thinking, what the fuck is wrong with this retard? If you go up to random strangers and just start screaming at them, there's going to be a lot of negative attention on that situation, and not on the person not wearing a mask. If you want to get a message across, then yelling is probably the last thing you want to do. You're making yourself look bad more than the person not wearing the mask. Like the other strategies in this article that were discussed, like ignoring it, having a conversation, even reporting them to store management, all those are fine, but I'm telling you right now, screaming and yelling like a little kid isn't going to accomplish anything other than make you look like you have some kind of mental disorder. And it's kind of sad that I, a 23-year-old, have to explain this to, full-grown adults. Like, think about it for a minute. A full-grown-ass adult author thought this was a good idea, and a full grown ass adult editor passed off on it. Think about that for a minute. So that concludes my response to this article. It actually wasn't nearly as bad as I thought it was going to be. Like, as soon as I saw the tagline, I'm thinking, oh shit, here we go again. But I start reading it, it's actually not bad. It actually gives some pretty good advice. I like the part where they go into detail discussing how to have conversations about masks. And if that's what this article was focused on, if that's what this was about, say an article about how to have a mask conversation, I'd actually be on board with that. I think this would have turned out pretty good. Some of the other advice given was also pretty sensible, like, ignoring it or even going to the store manager and saying, hey, this person's violating your rules and so forth. Even that's pretty reasonable. But it's absolutely asinine to even suggest that going up to people and yelling is in any way at all a good idea. You're not making yourself look good. You're not making the pro-mask movement look good. You're not, convincing anyone that wearing masks is good. Heck, you may even be spreading the virus more than the person not wearing the mask. Some other problems I had with this article is that it seemed to be very full of filler. There were a lot of points that were repeated, or where they would take one thing, phrase it differently, but essentially say the same thing and say, hey, this is new. Now, I'm not like an expert in writing or journalism by any stretch of the imagination, but I definitely think this author could work a bit on his writing style. Maybe learn to condense his thoughts and better organize them so that, you're much more likely to retain your reader's attention that way. And of course, a lot of the arguments seem to be based on emotion. Like, he appeals to your gut feelings or how you're feeling or reactions. It seems like he's very promotive of emotion-based decision making, and I think that's a problem. Like, if you feel like being nice, be nice, but if you feel like being an asshole, be an asshole. Yell if you want to yell. I think it would be much more productive to actually argue that people should get all the facts and all the information and make their decisions around that, not necessarily what their gut emotions are telling them. Because if you take his advice and give in to your gut emotions, now you start yelling at people, making yourself look bad more than the person not wearing the mask. But I think the biggest thing that I want people to take away from this video, other than you shouldn't yell at people who don't wear masks because you'll look like a fucking idiot, but I guess the biggest thing to take away from this video would be do some research, do your homework, learn about masks. And not just the pro-mask side of it, because yeah, there's a lot of pro-mask data out there, but there's a lot of anti-mask data too. Look at that. Look at the arguments on both sides. Look at the data on both sides. And make your decision. Because at the end of the day, whether or not to wear a mask is your decision. I can't tell you whether or not to wear a mask. Nobody else can tell you whether or not to wear a mask. That's for you to decide. And I think that the best way for you to make that decision is to get educated. Learn about all the arguments, pro-mask and anti-mask, and make your decision accordingly. Don't be a sheep. Wear a mask because you personally think it'll keep you and those around you safe, not because some politician or some dickhead in the parking lot who read this article yelled at you and told you to. But anyways, as always, this has been Philosophossum, making stupidity play dead. Hope everyone stays safe among these troubling times, and take care.